Welcome, everyone. I'm so happy to be hosting this webinar today. It's certainly been a long time coming, and I'm sure we're all looking forward to hearing from our panelists. Before we begin, we'd like to start with a land acknowledgement from the University of Toronto Press. We respectfully acknowledge the land on which we operate. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. Okay, so this session is being recorded, and if anyone has any questions, please feel free to put them in the Q&A, which I'll be monitoring, and we'll open that up towards the end of the session. With that, I'll turn it over to Natalie, who is Ken's editor.
From polarization to dialogue, such a worthy goal and so necessary right now. I really cannot think of a more timely topic for our fractured moment. And I know that our speakers today come with unique toolkits to help us see and speak to each other as fellow human beings. It is a privilege for me to introduce today's moderator, Ken Stern. I had the real honor of working with Ken on his now extremely needed book, The Conflict Over the Conflict, the Israel-Palestine Campus Debate. Since October 7th, when campuses were set aflame, this book and its author were a cooling influence, a voice of reason and rationality and empathy. Ken Stern is one of the leading experts on the subject of anti-Semitism and on hate and on free speech. For a quarter century, Stern was the American Jewish Committee's expert on anti-Semitism. He has testified before Congress, been an invited presenter at the White House Conference on Hate Crimes, and an official member of the United States delegation to the Stockholm International Forum on Combating Intolerance. He has argued before state and federal courts, including the U.S. Supreme Court. He is a regular contributor to both major Jewish and non-Jewish media outlets, and he is the editor of a UTP forthcoming collection on hate. And I strongly recommend to everyone here to check out a recent article that features Ken called The Problem with Defining Anti-Semitism in the New Yorker. Over to you, Ken.
Well, thank you so much for that kind introduction, Natalie, and thank you all for inviting me to be part of this important conversation. I've appreciated the opportunity to talk to IVO and to WENDY and to actually see their books, which I will mention. Actually, what I'll do is I'll hold them up. So I suggest you both. I'm learning a lot from both of them, and I recommend them to both of you, to everybody. So I'm going to do a brief introduction of both of them and then facilitate a discussion. And then Lucille's going to come back with about a quarter of two and moderate the questions. You don't have to wait until then if you want to put a question in the Q&A box, and hopefully we'll get to as many of those today as we can. So, and let me give the brief introductions and we'll get to the important part of the discussion. IVO Brugghmans studied philosophy, international politics, business management, and he worked for 25 years for a global management consulting firm supporting organizations in redesigning and transforming their businesses. He's fascinated by paradoxes and the challenge of bringing together opposite approaches. Connecting opposite poles has been a common thread throughout his own life and work as a philosopher working with practical business challenges, as a rationalist relying on his intuition, and as a workaholic enjoying doing simply nothing at all. He has written several books on this theme, developing a both-and perspective as a radical alternative to our, that this perspective helps create more sustainable solutions to the challenges of the 21st century, providing the fundamentals for a fulfilled and balanced life and for better performing and more innovative organizations and for a better world. He lives in Antwerp, Belgium. He gives keynotes, leads workshops and training programs on paradoxical leadership, and works with public and private organizations throughout Europe and around the world. Wendy Smith is the Dana J. Johnson Professor of Management, Faculty Director at the Women's Leadership Initiative at the Lerner College of Business and Economics at the University of Delaware, and a Fellow at the Academy of Management. She earned her PhD in Organizational Behavior at the Harvard Business School where she began her intensive research on strategic paradoxes, how leaders and senior teams effectively respond to contradictory yet interdependent demands. And working with executives and scholars globally, she received the Web of Silence Highly Cited Research Award 4 years in a row for being among the 1% most cited researchers in her field, and received the Decade Award from the Academy of Management Review for the most cited paper in the last 10 years, as well as a fellow in the Academy of Management. Her work has been published in such journals as the Academy of Management, Journal Administrative, Harvard Business Review, Organizational Science and Management Science. She has taught at the University of Delaware, Harvard, and the University of Pennsylvania Wharton, while helping senior leaders and middle managers all over the world address issues of interpersonal dynamics, team performance, organizational challenge, and innovation. Her book, which I just held up, was a #1 release on Amazon. She lives in Philadelphia with her husband, 3 children, and a family dog. So let me just jump into there. And this has been actually very easy to moderate because you guys have told me what questions you want me to ask and what order to ask them. And so I have the easiest job today. So let's start out with sharing, some real stories on polarization from your own experiences and how did things go and what did you learn? So I think Ivo's going to go first and then Wendy.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Ken. Well, yeah, I like to start with an example that is really personal and is really small because it concerns my own street. And I live in Antwerp, and I live in a small street, and in this street there is a speed limit of 30 kilometers an hour. But many cars drive through it in 70 kilometers an hour, and that's both dangerous, noisy, unsafe, etc. So I started a petition. I say, well, we need to flag this to the municipality so that they do something about it. And I started this petition with, well, the local street committee. And they were all quite enthusiastic. And people go around with the petition and we got a lot of positive feedback. And one day I received this very, very angry, even aggressive letter from one of the neighbors. I did not know him personally. And it was full of objections and accusations even, and saying, well, there is no problem of traffic whatsoever, and people and children shouldn't play at the streets. That is no place for children to be. And I was quite intolerant, and this process was not democratic, and the people were not listened to. And if I was not happy with living in the street, I should move further. I only lived there the last 4 years, so I was quite surprised, I would say, and because it was full of also false facts and things that were untrue. My first urge was to write an email because he wrote this email. So I said, well, I need to react. But anyway, I checked with some neighbors, and they say, well, we know him. He's always like that. Just ignore it. So I get 2 options. Either the simple option is ignoring, and the other one is reacting to that. But anyway, I said to myself, let's practice what I preach and what I teach others, and let's do it another way. So I invite him at my home, and to my surprise, he accepted the invitation and he came. And in the beginning was quite tense. And I introduced a little bit about myself because I only lived there for 4 years, and he lived there for 40 years. So that makes a difference. And he started reiterating his points of view, but at a softer tone of voice because it was face to face and it is not more anonymously. And listening, and I decided not to react or not to get into arguments or not get into this content discussion, but just listening to him and listening to his story. I don't see any incompatibilities with what I wanted to do. He raised the point that let's say the solution for the traffic issue should not be worse than the cure should not be worse than the problem. And I completely agree with that. But listening between the lines, it was not really about the content. It was not about traffic, but it was really about being recognized. And in the past, he had this experience, and I heard that also, that he was not consultant with when the committee, the street committee organized things, and he was not taken seriously, and it was a little bit put aside, etc. And this was in fact the real reason why he was so opposite this idea. So he was not opposite the idea, he was really getting frustrated and getting and he needed a point to get his frustration out. So at the end of 1 hour, he thanked me very much for the conversation, and I said, "Well, it was a great conversation." And he said, "Well, where can I sign the petition without me doing anything?" So the lesson I learned from that, it is really not about the content. The content is just an instrument, and any content can be used for that. It is really also not about the values that may be different or ideologies that may be different, but it's most on a really basic human aspect. It is about recognizing people, also this having a person with the status of living 40 years in this neighborhood, while I'm a newcomer of 4 years, and not being recognized for that. So it is much on a very deeper basic level where often you can find each other. And if I look at my work, I see exactly the same. We do a lot of exercises with organizations. We organize kind of discussions, and polarized discussions where one team is in one side and another on another side. And what I often see is that it's so easy to get dragged down into the content and stay there in the content, and also get down in this play of action reaction. And you see then parties moving in on each extreme, etc. And you see then the shift happening where there is kind of genuine interest, genuine listening, and an authentic interest in each other. And then, in fact, the tone of voice of the whole conversation changes. And that is something that also happened in this case. So that is my small town experience in this.
Great, thank you, Wendy.
Yeah. First of all, I want to just say thank you. I'm so grateful, Ken. Thank you for moderating this discussion. And Ivo and I have been in conversation about the ideas of paradox and how they inform polarization for a long time now. And I am so grateful, Ivo, to be in conversation with you around these ideas together. And I'm also grateful for the many of you that are online, so many of you whose names are popping up that I have been in this journey with along the way, studying these ideas, and so many new names. So thank you all for being here and in this conversation. The idea of polarization, it's almost like it has become a huge issue in our world today. And I wanted to take a step back and say, what do we mean by that? If you look up the idea of the concept of polarization, on one hand, this is a physical reality. Polarization is the dividing of light waves into separate forms, pulling them apart. And yet when we use that word, what we're looking at is groups of individuals or groups of people in conflict where the positions feel so distinct, so separate, that it feels like it is impenetrable to get to some kind of solution. And I too have had the experience like Ivo, where that polarization happens at a personal level. Sometimes I like to talk about the intractable conflicts that my husband and I have over minor concerns of parenting. They also happens at an organizational level. I have this memory, and we write about this in our book, of sitting on an airplane and turning to the person next to me. And I tend to be kind of a social person. So I said, "Hey, what do you do?" And it turns out that the person next to me was the manager of a circus for many, many years. And I then spent the entire airplane ride hearing about the intractable conflicts that happen when you run a circus between the performers, the elephant riders, and the acrobats, and management. And certainly that was a set of conflicts that this manager was never able to create the similarities across. And while those examples might seem quaint, they then bubble up from those small moments of conflict into what feels like, or what has become, an impasse in our national and international politics. And, as Natalie introduced Ken in exploring the tensions that are going on in the Middle East, I was just telling Ivo and Ken, I just came from a dialogue here at the university between Jewish and Muslim faculty to talk about what feels like an intractable and impenetrable conflict that goes back thousands, millions, I don't know, thousands of years. And certainly I'm sitting here in the East Coast of the United States. We are coming upon an election, and we are feeling that kind of tension with opposite points of view in our national politics, right and left, conservative and liberal, and that has implications for our national politics. And so when we talk about polarization, and the question that I think we are exploring today is what feeds those kinds of polarizing moments, and what enables us to get past them. And I am really looking forward to exploring how this lens of paradox might help us do that.
So let me then jump into asking you to delve a little bit more into that. Just for your audience, what do you mean when you use the word paradox? What do you mean when you use both and? Can you describe that so people know exactly what you're getting at?
Yeah, and maybe I'll start, and then Ivo, turn it over to you, because I think I have been as an academic, starting when I was a doctoral student over 25 years ago, exploring this concept of paradox. And I will tell you, I've said this before to my colleagues, for many years, the academics said, hey, don't use that word of paradox. People don't get it. And the real people don't get it, meaning those people outside of academia. And actually in academia, we don't get it either. And what we have seen over the last 10, 15 years is that this notion of paradox has bubbled up and become a really important term for leaders, for organizations, for political leaders. And so we really are starting to converge around this as an important lens for me and for us. And when I say us, it's myself and my co-author colleague for many years, Marianne Lewis. What we mean by paradox is opposing tensions that are also interdependent. And here's what we mean by that. We see paradox as not just that we experience tensions in the world. In the world, we experience conflicting tug of wars. We feel them, whether it's tensions about what do I do in my career? How do I parent my children? How do I decide on how to navigate a piece of land in the Middle East? Whatever level of tensions, there are issues that come up. We experience those tensions as a dilemma, where dilemma is a trade-off, where it feels like they're in conflict with one another and they can't both be true. That's how they show up for us, because it's a question of how do I allocate my time? Am I going to spend my, when it's parenting and I'm dealing with work-life tensions, do I spend my time tonight doing more work and getting a work project done, or do I go home and be with my kids? In the Middle East, who has access over Jerusalem? And those show up as dilemmas that feel like we have to make a decision, a trade-off, or an either-or decision. And what we argue is that underlying those decisions, if we take a different lens on those issues, what we see underlying those are paradoxical demands, opposing pressures that, if we look at them more closely, we can't choose between them because they are intertwined with one another, so that together they form a more unified system. And so underlying questions of how do I spend my time are issues of, do I focus on myself or the other, where what we know is that the more we focus on ourselves, the more resources we have to enable the other. The more we focus on others, the more we feel beneficial about ourselves. They can lead to a beneficial, virtuous cycle, but we have to see them that way. It's a yin yang. And so when we talk about paradox, what we are looking at is a different lens, a lens that is more holistic, more interdependent, more unified on the tensions, challenges, issues that we face in the world. Ivo, maybe I'll toss it over to you.
Right, yeah. Well, absolutely. This is the essence of both thinking or paradoxical leadership. And if I translate that to the question, from my view on polarization, is that polarization is for me an issue of identity and identification. You can associate with a specific value, free speech, for example, or with a specific view, but also you have to take contact with the opposite of it, because it is limited. You have also, it's, well, like you say, it is intertwined. It is, you have these both things are interdependent. And the problem starts when you completely identify with just one value, how beautiful this value might be, for example, or then you make this value absolute, and that you get it into a purist form, so that you leave aside the opposite pole. And for example, inclusion, what is a very, very beautiful value, can be a very exclusive thing if you take it as an identity. If you say, well, because we are inclusive and we oppose to people who are not inclusive, so we exclude the people who are exclusive. So in fact, everything, every value can be, in their absolute form, can be a form of identification, and their aspect of polarization happens, because there you one pole against the other pole, and you project everything what is the counterpole to the other side. Now, I think it's interesting to see that what I tried to show with the example is that, and what you also said, Wendy, is that well, the both end is not on the content side, because on the content side, on the superficial side, it is a kind of, it is presented as an either-or question. Are we going to put a parking lot there in the street, or are we going to having a nice green area for children to play? So it is kind of either-or. You can see below that are there conflicting values, and this is this aspect of paradox. And if you have conflicting values, because they are intertwined and interdependent, you can have a both end. You can say, well, how can we have, let's say, mobility on the one hand, people driving where they want, and on the other hand, well, having well-being and have a nice green spaces. And often with polarization, it is not really about, in my view, about these paradoxes often, because it's on a very, on a level even below that, because it is really, like in the example, not about, let's say, ideological differences, of differences in value, of differences in view that you can bring together, but it is really about some basic egoic needs. And I mean with egoic needs like my identity, or my safety, or my status, or my being recognized, or being seen, or being heard, or having control on my life, of having influence and power. These are the drivers that are at the deepest level, and often polarization is about this level. And ideologies, religion, values, point of view are only often instruments that are used, in fact, to get this thing on this lower level going, because it is about these basic needs that are often the conflict. And it's interesting, because that is what people often have the same. It is not about the different views, but it's in fact they want both the same. They want both control, they want both safety, they want both, let's say, being seen and being recognized. And often we focus too much on the content, on the very superficial level, or on the values, but we forget this basic human needs that is about identity, status, safety, etc. So I think reevaluating these basic these basic needs that we all have, because we tend to say from each other, well, we have very high moral values, and the other party, well, they have very low egoic drives. Anyway, but recognizing also that you have the same lower egoic drives than the other party, that is also recognizing the other in yourself. And that is also the start of, well, opening up and making this move toward the other side. Instead of putting yourself morally above someone, you put yourself on the same level. That is how I see this paradoxical lens on polarization.
Yeah, and what you're both describing really resonates with a lot of what I've been seeing, especially going to campuses the last few months, on a number of different levels. So sort of the polarization, but each side very much wanting to be heard, the perception that they're not heard, and then seeing things that are almost symbolic in terms of looking for, is the statement supporting us? Is the statement not supporting us? So the things that are driving, a lot of the polarization. Natalie mentioned the book that I'm working on. We have a philosopher who's an ethicist, and part of what's going to come out in that chapter is just a question of, the book is about advising NGOs, non-governmental organizations, civil society, they're fighting hate, what to look at, what to think about, what to do, what not to do from their different experiences. And one of the questions, is, should there be some form of a Hippocratic oath for people that are fighting hate? At least have a perception that you're going to do no harm. So, that very much leads into the question that I think the conversation should go to next that you guys propose is, really what strategies do you think are ones that could be helpful in these types of tense conflicts, and which ones are counterproductive? And if you could explain a little bit about why you think some of the strategies are useful and why you think some of them are counterproductive.
I mean, Ivo, I can start, and then I want to just start. One of the reasons we wrote the book Both and Thinking was exactly that, was to invite us into thinking about tools to move us from the either or to the both and. And the first step is to notice how often we either or. And Ken, I want to keep us in this Middle East conflict for a moment, in part because it's where I'm just coming from and I have had multiple conversations around, and is the epitome of polarization. I was in conversation with a student on campus, a Muslim student on campus, about a week ago. And this student said to me, my heart is breaking for what is going on in Gaza. And I am appalled, and my heart is breaking for the hostages that were taken on October 7th. And by the way, I want to just pause for those of you that are listening, pull you in for a minute, because as I say Muslim student, before I even tell you what the student says, I want you to just think in your mind what you are assuming about this student's point of view about what's going on in the Middle East. What you are assuming. Because as soon as you hear Muslim student, what might be going through your mind is, oh, this student is worried about Palestinians. And because they're worried about Palestinians, they must not be worried about what's going on for Israelis and hostages. And that student, in fact, and by the way, that's where we tend to think, because what we assume, where we go when we think about these polarizing high conflict situations, is we go to that either or. And if we notice how quickly we go to that either or, we notice how quickly we assume the oversimplification of the conflict. But in fact, what that student said to me is, my heart is breaking for the thousands of kids in Gaza, people in Gaza that are dying. My heart is also breaking for how horrific this was as hostages. And I am afraid to say the second part of that publicly, because people will assume that if I say anything about hostages, therefore, I do not believe that, and I am not in support of or want to address what's going on in Gaza. So the first piece, if you're here listening, what I would want to invite you into, maybe the first thing to walk away from this conversation, is to notice how in our minds we have this psychological tendency that we all do to really go to the black and white, assume the either or, and assume if you believe X, then you must not believe Y. And that's true whether it's, Israel-Palestine, and that's true whether it's the gun debate in the United States, and that's true whether it's other the polarizing tensions or conversations we're having about conflict. The assumptions that we make is that if you believe X, you must not also be able to make room in your mind and in your heart for the opposite of X. And the invitation, if you will, to walk out of this session is to notice that. Because if you can notice, if we can all notice how quickly we go to the either or in these polarizing conflicts, in these polarizing moments, then maybe we can invite ourselves into opening up the question of, wait, is it possible to live into the both and? Could we in our own hearts, and then could we extend to others the possibility that individuals can live into the complexity that I can believe, I can hold the pain of both Israelis and Palestinians. I can believe, I can hold respect for both liberals and conservatives. I can believe, I can hold that in the circus, both the administrators and the performers have space that they need to be attended to. Because if we can do that, then we can have a more complex conversation about how to make room and space for both of those.
Yeah, exactly. And it's I think this both and thinking is really anti-reductionist, because we and in the crux is, like you said, it is self-reflection. It is really being aware of this primal drive that you have really to if someone reacts to me, I've directly the urge to go in the other position, and it's so tempting to do so. So I think it is keeping open your identity, and we have embracing, in fact, that we have kind of internal diversity, and that we are very ambiguous creatures with very conflicting feelings, emotions, views, values, and that's okay. And if we can stay open ourselves, we don't reduce ourselves to one aspect of ourselves, what is really diminishing our full personality. But also, if we look at others that we don't, that we have the tendency to typecast, or to go in the same direction. I want to also see about, things that don't work, and what is often done to react to polarization is, for example, to limit free speech, because then they say, well, it's dangerous, we have to limit that. But anyway, that is only fueling polarization, because then people can say with right conviction, right, I'm a victim, I'm not hurt, I'm not, and so you only make it bigger. And if something that is forbidden, that goes underground, and that grows stronger and stronger. Another thing that doesn't help, I think, is to see this idea in, let's say, in moral terms. Let's say we are the forces of light, and they are the forces of evil, or we are civilization and they are barbaric. This moral point of view doesn't help. It doesn't help make people still feel more unheard and really put aside. What also often is used is that, let's explain it again to the person because he doesn't understand. So we're going to explain because, well, maybe he's not well informed. That is also a very patronizing kind of thing that that works counterproductive. And yeah, it is the key. I think the key is also that extremists can grow because we deny the problem, that there is a problem, and this way this extremists can become monopolists of a certain problem. And if once a problem is in hands of extremists, then it is very difficult because there's this colleague of mine, Dutch philosopher Bart Brandsma, who has this model of polarization where you have on the one end of it, you have the pushers, that they're the people who really have a benefit in starting up this polarization because this gives them status, this gives them importance, they get attentions to it. And they are not really interested in solving the issue because then they will lose their status, they will lose their position. So they have all interest in making it bigger. And they also fully identified with the solution. So, for example, Putin, he can't go back because he publicly identified with my fate is with conquering Ukraine. So, in fact, we often focus our attention to talking to the people on the extremes, but I think that is in certain ways it is well, it's just losing time because, in fact, you can better focus on what Bart Brandsma called the silent majority. That is the people who are in the middle, who really feel the tension, who feel the problem, but are not really identified with one or another solution. So we tend to go up to put our attention to the people who are really shouted most and make the most noise. But anyway, we should focus on the people really who are in the silent majority, in the middle.
It's very helpful from both of you. We have, I think, time for one more question before we get to Q&A. But a couple of things I'd love you to think about a little bit more. I mean, Ivo, I really appreciate your comment about free speech and the importance of it, because I think in a lot of these different circumstances, there's a tendency to want to use instruments of either hecklers' vetoes or legislation, or whatever, to stop speech we don't like, and people feel good about it because don't want somebody to say that, but for legal and other reasons, you know, as we all know, that's counterproductive, makes martyrs out of people and so forth. But, you know, I've heard both of you really talk about what individuals can do and how we should think about these things in new ways. And I think that's incredibly important. But what do you do with the fact that the politics of the time really pushes people into these buckets? We're going to see it around the 2024 election in the United States, because if hatred didn't work in politics, politicians wouldn't use it. So the anti-immigrant, the anti-Muslim stuff, that's going to be there. It's going to be a driver for cable news. It's a driver for social media. So, you know, we're all trying to think about how do we think about these things, but all these forces that pull communities in the other direction. And, you know, it got me to think about really happy that you shared that interaction you had with the Muslim student, Wendy. And, you know, that's, you know, I've seen students, Jewish students too, who were also somewhat concerned about saying things that would be seen as betrayal. So how do you suggest to somebody who has the empathy, who does this type of thinking, who can see beyond their identity, but is fearful that they're going to get marked as a betrayer, as a traitor? How do you encourage them to do something, even when you know that, you know, there have been circumstances, and I've been dealing with this too, where students are getting doxxed and otherwise threatened? So how do you get them to stand up this way in a political climate?
Ivo, I don't know if you want to go ahead. I can offer.
Yeah, well, they do.
Ken, I think that we have to remember that I want to be clear. This is going to sound naive, but I think it's particularly poignant. We have to remember that politics is personal and politics is about people. This morning, as I was driving into the university, I was listening to a podcast about the various different efforts toward peace agreements in the Middle East. And a key to those peace agreements in the Middle East was a question of who had held what relationships between the U.S. presidents and U.S. Peace negotiators who were brokering these deals, the Israeli leadership and political leadership, and the Palestinian leadership, and which Palestinian leaders and how. And a key to whether those deals, and the Egyptian leaders in the earlier forms of some of the conversations, and a key to analyzing whether agreements went forward was a question of who held what relationships with which leaders. And the problem that we have today, and so the result of that, or the important insight there, is that if we are navigating polarization, we have to start with the conversations and the points of connection between people, because that's where, and the stronger we can build trust and strengthen relationships, the more that we have the opportunity to be able to build policy in which we have people that are going to be able to adhere or to engage in that policy, rather than building policy or communications or in which one side is happy and the other side isn't. And so the invitation there is to start with these conversations. The problem, and that's what we just did on campus right before this conversation, is that we at the University of Delaware sat down to invite people on opposing sides of the Middle East conflict to just talk and connect. And I'm so grateful. I think our facilitator, Shelley, is sitting here in this conversation with us today, who brilliantly invited us to just talk and connect and not come up with an agenda going forward, but really to just foster connection. The problem we have today is that our institutions, social media, technology, politics, invite us to be in conversation mediated by the press, mediated by social media, that don't hold us responsible for relationships. And that's where I think much of what we are doing is breaking down. And so if we are to overcome that, then the invitation is, how do we move on our campuses? How do we move in our communities? How do we move in our institutions to advance? And again, it sounds quite naive, but to advance those personal relationships first, to foster that possibility of finding, if not not some place that everybody agrees, but finding place where we can agree to disagree and move forward. Where, and I think I see my colleague Lotta Lusher here, who used the word, where we could find a workable certainty, something that invites us to move forward for the moment and be in ongoing conversation with one another across these opposing ideas. That's the invitation, to be in conversation interpersonally.
Yeah, completely agree. Well, we can't solve polarization because there are a lot of sociological factors lying below them, and it is like a shift in power and influence between different groups in society, and also a gap in inequality, etc. But we cannot solve it. But what we can do is, in fact, break this, let's say, this cycle of action and reaction. And doing this, well, the first step is, like you said, is interpersonal. It is looking people in the eyes and having really, yeah, a face-to-face conversation, because it's very easy to hide yourself behind the screen and just writing very nasty emails to each other. But having this face-to-face contact is one and foremost the most important, because this is the aspect of rehumanizing. You see the other again as a human person and not as a kind of incarnation of evil or whatsoever. And I think what's very important is this aspect of self-reflection. That is also self-reflection about when you are going into this cycle again of action, reaction, etc., but also owning your own shadow side, because what irritates you in others are often parts of yourself that you don't admit or don't allow. If I'm getting angry to my colleague who leaves early while I'm working very hard and tedious, then it says something about myself. Well, maybe I should foster my own go with the flow aspect of myself more, and I would be less triggered by the behavior of someone else. So it is much to do about self-reflection, also self-reflection about your own basic drives. Like I said, we often think we have all kind of rationalizations about our high esteemed motives, and we see the other as being very greedy and egoistic, while we exactly do the same, but with other means. For example, if we say, well, if people morally look down to people who are xenophobic, for example, they do exactly the same. They feel themselves morally superior than the other. So admit and see these patterns with yourself. And I think it starts there with yourself. And the second step is then, if you talk to someone, go beyond the surface and don't focus really on the horrible solutions they propose, but on the signal they're giving with these horrible solutions. And maybe what is the positive drivers below that? And what is the pain below that? So, and start from that pain and recognizing that pain. And there you start up the dialogue. Otherwise, you getting bogged down in this yes and no discussions.
Anyway, thank you both. And Lucille, you want to come back and join us and start asking some of the questions? I'm eager to hear the answers.
Yes, thank you so much. That was such a great discussion. We have a couple of questions in the chat, although if anyone would like to ask our panelists the questions themselves, please just raise your hand and I'll unmute you. So Elko, I believe you wanted to ask your question personally. Just I can unmute you right now if you would prefer that.
Yes, thank you. My question relates to the practical issue. If you have, for example, racism, sexism on the work floor, and as a management team, you want to prohibit that. You say, oh, you can go with guidelines, sanctions, whatever. But that behavior represents part of society. But it doesn't mean it's approvable, but it's there. So how can you practically use the paradox? I got some more tips actually at the end, but how can you practically use this paradox thinking to sort out these issues, to humanize the other?
Wendy.
Elko, first of all, thank you, Elko, and for inviting us into opening up this dialogue more broadly. There's so much to say here. You know, I want to just reiterate what Ivo said. So when we talk about the problems of either-oring, we talk about the vicious cycles that happen when you either-or. And one of them we call trench warfare, because the idea is that what we do as humans is that we don't only pull two things apart, assume that we have to pick a side, we then surround ourselves with other people that believe us to reinforce what we believe, because otherwise we feel anxious. And it's like being in a trench where you sort of dig your side and surround yourself with other people. We talk about it as confirmation bias or socialization pressures, in which we are surrounded by people similar to us. And then we shoot out at the other side. And like in a trench, we shoot out the other side without even knowing them. We dehumanize them. We diminish who they are. So until we are in conversation and connection with them, we don't actually have more nuanced possibilities of coming together. Elko, I think the invitation, whether it's on the work floor or whether it's in the C-suite or whether it's in the halls of government, is to start by crossing that trench into no man's land, shaking hands and understanding the different points of view. And if that's people on the work floor who are using sexist, racist conversations, the first question is what's going on and why is that coming up? And is there a conversation to be had in a more personal way right there that could invite in some of the underlying fears that inform their sexism and racism that might allow them to then be able to be more expansive in their thinking?
Exactly, and it is about the underlying fears and anxieties that and I think that, well, what doesn't work, I think, is to try to silence it with all kind of rules, and then because then it goes underground. If you don't address it, it becomes nastier and nastier, because then on the surface there is no problem, but at the deeper level, these visions and these views stay and they become more profound, because you may not talk about it, and it is taboo to talk about it. So it's better to open up the discussion, but not start the discussion really on the underlying level. Why is it so? Why is that? Why does that touches you? Why? And I think there, if you can moderate that discussion, that can open up a lot of things. But to silence it with all kind of rules or regulations, etc., that would be counterproductive in my sense.
Thank you.
Okay, we can move on to the next question, which is from Cabello. I hope I'm pronouncing your name right. This is for you, Ivo. This is such a needed conversation. I completely agree, even in the DEI sector, about absolute values such as inclusion. In research, I look at the experience of white men in organizations in the US and South Africa, yet even mentioning a focus on understanding the view of this group raises eyebrows in the DEI community. How do we deal with movements that think they have the ultimate authority on the content of DEI? That could be consultants or universities, not being open to a paradox lens, meaning those on the so-called inside sometimes do not even see their own blind sides.
Exactly, and it is, well, every movement can turn out to something extremist, and even, well, you see it in the whole woke debate also, that something that is initially a very good idea becomes very extremist and become very moralistic, etc., and it gets blindsided and getting really included in itself. So there also, I think it is, you can focus the attention to the people who really are on the extremes, but it's also interesting to start a discussion with this middle ground, people that are on the middle ground, because there, I think you have much more. If you let, for example, the extremists become monopolists of the issue, then you have woke and anti-woke. Well, then, and these extremists, they love to create this divide because they have a lot of interest in creating this divide. So anyway, addressing this issue with the let's say the more moderate middle group would, I think, be the best way to deal, instead of focusing all on both sides of the spectrum. I don't know if this is an answer, but
yeah, and Lucille, I want to add to that too. Cabello, I love that question for a variety of reasons. What I want to answer to that question is what we argue is the number one tool of both anding, which is changing the questions we ask. Changing the question from what role are white men involved in the DEI movement, to how do we accommodate and invite and engage white men when we think about DEI. And I want to empathize. When I started, so as Ken said, one of the things I do at the university is I am our faculty director of our Women's Leadership Initiative. And when I started that, several people came up to me and told me, well, what, you don't care about men? And I want to just notice, both in your question and in that question that was posed to me, that underlying assumption there that we all tend to take, which is that if you put a stake in the ground in one place, in the DEI space around women or around people of color or around, the assumption is that you therefore don't or are not attending to anybody else. And I think that's what your question points to, is how quickly people make that assumption, that either or assumption. And I see online here my colleagues, Monica Iboda, I want to just give you a shout out there. And again, Shelley Clay Robinson, who's been doing this work with me in around gender and gender equity. We have made a very clear argument that our goal is to advance equity in service of advancing voices for all. And that means inviting in and being in conversation with white men about their experiences in this relationship. That's critical. And so the point here is, how do we change the conversation or change the questions we ask? Not, are we just attending to traditionally underrepresented minorities, but how do we in this work of DEI create the experiences and opportunity where everyone can come and be their best self and all boats rise?
Exactly. And I think that is the core of our paradoxical and both and thinking, that is asking the how question. How can we connect A and B? How can we, let's say, for example, give livelihood to farmers and on the other hand, protect our biodiversity? And this is not a question that we have to answer ourselves. The intelligence is in the system. So in effect, what this leader should do is ask the different questions. And of course, first of all, there need to be a kind of basic understanding and basic recognition. But if this is there, then you can ask these questions. And I think that is the core things that leaders should do in this age. That is reformulating the questions from an either or into how can we have both, and how can we do that both without giving the answers, but facilitating the dialogue about this.
Thank you both. We're already at the 2 p.m. mark, so I think we have time for just 2 more questions really quickly. One from Andre, who says, living in the Netherlands, we are told by our government and media that Russians are the bad guys and the West are the good guys regarding Ukraine. And it is almost impossible to talk about peace talk because you are named a Putin lover. If you dive into the background on the conflict in Ukraine, you find a lot of people who talk about the aggression of NATO towards Russia and the regime change that might be created by the CIA. But the dialogue about this subject is simply not allowed because we must believe that we must defeat Russia or else they will conquer all of Europe. How can we promote the possibility of peace talks if our government and media don't want to talk about peace?
Good question. Yeah. Because on both sides, there is, of course, we see Russia as the extreme evil, but also there they have basic needs of safety, needs to get access to to ice-free harbors. Let's say also the pride of being a nation, etc. That was very badly harmed after the fall of the Soviet Union. I think all these aspects in, let's say, in a peace process, a future peace process that won't happen with Putin, for example, because he has already really pointed down his fate with the conquering of Ukraine, etc. But in a post-Putin era, these are the things that we need to be settled together. I think this is the both end. How can we create safety for both sides? How can we, let's say, create economic wealth for both sides? And how can, let's say, a multipolar world flourish with different powers that have their own influence?
Thank you. And then I think Freyer has his hand raised. I'm just going to give you the opportunity to ask live. Go ahead.
You're on mute.
Now it's okay?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yes. The question is simple. Are you planning to give more webinar about this important topic? Because I think that you are doing a great job, and we have to do, or you have to do, a lot of about this and disseminate this idea and this understanding is quite needed. And I add something also in my chat. I think that people are able to read it. I can read it myself to all of you, but I think everything goes about communication. I think that general listening and understanding and general interest is quite important. And I say also that I think that you have to give this lecture also in the inside of the United Nations and inside of the European Commission, because I think that we can win a lot of in at this very moment, understand each other, and I think that through understanding we can achieve more that we have been achieving at this very moment in the world. That's it. And the question is, are you planning to do more about this? It's possible to know when, Ivo, you know
Well,
me.
anyway,
So
we will, of course. Well, maybe it's a good idea, Wendy, because it's a hot topic, and we only scratch, I think, the surface, and there's so much to say about this. Anyway, maybe this is a start for a whole series. So I don't know, but let's see. I don't know how you see that, Wendy.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm so glad. Thank you for saying that. The hope is that it's from these words to people's actions, to the ability for people, because, it's one thing to say this, and it's another thing to emotionally feel it. I have a doctoral student, a postdoc who I'm working with now, who's doing some deep work into COP negotiators and how they navigate these competing demands and opposing pressures in those kinds of negotiations, because truly they need to come up with both ands to figure out how to create international policy, and it is deeply emotional. And that is the work that both Marianne and I, and Ivo, I know that you see ourselves doing, which is inviting people to be able to sit with these difficult either ors and reframe them and live into the possibility of both and with them, whether it's in companies, whether it is in our political institutions.
Okay, I think we're a little bit past 2, but that's fine. I mean, this was such a great discussion. Thank you so much, Ivo, Wendy, and Ken. And thank you for everyone who joined and asked questions. We'll be sending a recording out after this. Yeah, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank
Or
you.
evening.
Thank you.
Bye.